also most assuredly does not refer to Jesus as Christians allege. The first verse says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me and from the words of my roaring?" This verse is not messianic for many reasons. A, the cry is contrary to Psalm 46:1, which says, "God is our refuge and strength, a help in times of trouble." Certainly God was not a refuge to help the crucified Jesus. B, if this refers to Jesus, did he pray for the salvation of his flesh or his divinity? If his flesh, then his prayers were unanswered. He died. If his divinity, the divine needs no salvation. It's eternal. C, in the second verse, Psalm 22, in the second verse of Psalm 22, the same speaker says, quote, "I cry in the daytime, but thou hearest not, and in the night season I am not silent," unquote. This is contrary to Isaiah 42:2, which Christians also attribute to Jesus, and which says, quote, "He shall not cry, nor lift up, nor cause his voice to be heard in the street," unquote. But Jesus did cry, as is also shown by the shortest verse in the Bible, which says, Jesus wept. Moreover, the sufferings of the speaker in Psalm 22:2 continued for a time. He cried to God for help day and night, whereas Jesus cried for only a short period. D, in the 6th verse, the speaker says, "I am a worm, a maggot." Would Jesus call himself a worm, a maggot? E, the 16th verse of this psalm says, "They pierced my hands and my feet." Yet nowhere in the Gospels does it say that the feet of Jesus were pierced or nailed to the cross, despite the crucifixes you see. Crucified persons didn't have their feet nailed to a cross. Many Hebrew scholars say this should have been translated as, "They cling like a lion to my hands and feet," and no group ever clung to the hands or feet of Jesus. F, in the 20th verse, the same speaker says, "Deliver my soul from the sword." But Jesus didn't die with a sword. And G, the description of this speaker's distress while facing deadly peril, his worry in prayer, and his desire to be delivered from death are unsuitable to Christ, who supposedly gave himself up to death freely. In the 11th verse, the speaker says, quote, "Be not far from me, for trouble is near, for there is none to help," and indicates that if someone had been available to help, if Jesus had said this, he would have gladly accepted assistance. His death occurred against his will. How then can Christians say he willed it? That completes our coverage of messianic prophecies for today. In our next program, we'll continue showing why these prophecies couldn't be applied to Jesus. We'd like to conclude by reading a sympathetic letter we received some time ago from Michigan. The writer says, quote, "A biblicist I know," that's somebody who believes and defends the Bible, "a biblicist I know is using as proof for the resurrection the claim that the writers of the Gospels suffered terrible deaths for not renouncing their message. If their story was a jointly concocted lie, surely one of them at least would have renounced it to save his life. Since they were separated by great distances, the other disciples would never have known about any member's defection from the cause. This sounds persuasive, but I suspect a shell game. What historical evidence do you know of that tells about the tortuous deaths of Jesus' disciples? For that matter, What reliable information is there about any part of the life of any disciple?" Unquote. To this I replied, "Biblicist constantly assert that the alleged unwillingness of the apostles and other prominent believers in Jesus, that the willingness of the apostles and other prominent defenders and believers in Jesus to die for the cause substantiates Christianity, because who would die for something they knew was a lie?" Two major flaws are immediately obvious with this reasoning. First, where is the evidence that the apostles and other prominent disciples of Jesus died for the cause? A lot is said about the martyred deaths of Peter and Paul, for instance, but no proof is provided. Certainly the Bible says nothing in this regard. In fact, the only New Testament believers that could even be considered martyrs for the cause were Stephen and possibly John the Baptist. The Bible says nothing about the deaths of Peter, Paul, Mark, John, Matthew, James, and many others. From whence biblicists derive this mythology, one can only speculate. Secondly, millions of people have perished for what they mistakenly and erroneously believed was a just cause. Hitler's troops died believing God was on their side. They even had Gott mit uns on their belt buckles, which is translated as God with us. The fact that people are willing to die for a cause has nothing to do with its truthfulness. As we noted in a prior program, few people would willingly die for what they knew was a lie, but many would willingly die for what they erroneously thought was true. That completes our presentation. And please join us later for the 36th edition of Biblical Errancy Commentary, when we'll continue showing why the Bible is nothing more than the flawed composition of some fallible human beings. Thank you for listening.